Well, welcome to Maplewood Cemetery. When we set this date, we thought we'd be here on a nice, crisp, fall afternoon. So we're pleasantly surprised at this very nice weather. But welcome everyone. We're just overwhelmed with the turnout, the interest in this project. This is our first cemetery tour. We've done walks around town. We've gone to churches in town. We've done Bruce Springsteen tours. I say we, I'm including Kevin Coyne. We've done church tours, Springsteen tours, just tours around the borough to show some historic sites. So today our idea is to tell the story of Freehold through its early families, through the people who rest here. You'll see many names that you'll recognize. You'll see names from our streets. You'll see names like Throckmorton, common names in western Monmouth County. So we'll take you around the cemetery. We're basically going to begin here and take a pretty good loop around the cemetery, and we'll end up back here. The tour will end here. This tour is sponsored or is held in conjunction with our Historic Preservation Commission, which serves a number of roles in Freehold Borough. And I'd like to ask Bree, who's the chairperson, just to say a word about HPC.
Thank you everybody so much for coming out. It's so great to see you all. The HBC exists to really protect our heritage for the future, and that could be tangibles in the case of buildings, of our beautiful architecture, and intangible in the case of the people who lived and contributed here and created the history that we all wish to preserve. So thank you so much, and please come to an HBC meeting.
Thank you. We have members of our governing body here. We'd like to recognize our mayor. Just join us, Kevin. Kevin Kane is here. Councilwoman Sharon Schetzer. Annette Jordan is here. Annette is here somewhere. There she is, Annette. And from our downtown business group, Jeff Friedman is here. So we'd like to welcome you.
Adam, right.
Oh, Adam, excuse me. I couldn't see. Sorry, Adam, couldn't see over there. As we go through, the tour, we're going to kind of concentrate on two areas. One is the educational system that was developed in Freehold and gave rise to people who went on to Ivy League educations, went on to set the foundation for a future vice president of the United States. We had a number of schools here, and Kevin's going to share that with you. We're also going to kind of talk about newspapers, which are an important part of life in the 1850s up through the Civil War. Newspapers held a very important role. They were very political. There was a Republican newspaper, and there was a Democratic newspaper, and they both played important roles in town. So with that, we're going to start. As we walk along, you'll notice different style monuments. As we get into the older section of the cemetery, you'll see traditional monuments lit. Maybe you'd see an old tenant. Very old style, they'll be evident to you, old style monuments. We'll get into more of the Victorian look, and then as we come this direction through the cemetery, you'll see that monuments have evolved over time and become more what we know of today as a traditional monument. Some tell stories. They're epitaphs. They give warnings to people about what the future could bring, how they should live their lives. As we come into a more modern time, you'll see pictures and different messages. You'll see markers from fire companies, the Elks Lodge, the Masonic Lodge, those kind of markers. You'll see markers from the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, and also the American Legion. The Grand Army of the Republic was kind of the veterans group. It was kind of the American Legion of the Civil War, and held a tremendous amount of political power post-Civil War. So you'll see some GAR markers as we go along. And just what?
Say something about the cemetery.
Let me tell you about the cemetery. We're standing in what is today Maplewood Cemetery. The original cemetery was called Freehold Cemetery, and we're going to go to that part. It's over in that far corner toward Route 9. That cemetery was opened in the 1850s by the Reformed Church here in Freehold. Burials were conducted, and then in the 1860s, a group incorporated and formed Maplewood Cemetery and took over the cemetery from the Reformed Church. Now, reading between the lines in the old newspapers, it sounded like the people in town were happy to have different management of the cemetery, if you will. So that they were very pleased that Maplewood was started. The section that we're standing in here was a separate cemetery. This was called Green Lawn Cemetery, and it was founded by this person, by Mr. Parker. So this, from this area back, you can see that monument. It's a very prominent monument in this cemetery. He founded what was called Green Lawn and made improvements. There was a swamp at this end. He drained the swamp, fenced the area. The roadways we were laughing about before he started. These roadways were called avenues, and he put the avenues in, established the blocks, and Greenwood operated until the 1930s when it merged together with Maplewood. So today, this is all Maplewood Cemetery. But it started from Freehold Cemetery to Maplewood Cemetery to taking on Green Lawn. The area across the street was bought from the Moreaus as a park section when it was originally developed, flat markers. As this side of the cemetery filled and there weren't plots available, the monuments were permitted across the street. So you'll see upright monuments now on the other side of the street. That was originally designed as a park section, flat marker section.
And this is mostly white Protestants, right? Because each church had its own. If those of you who grew up in St. Rose as I did, I can count on one hand the number of times I was here before I did this, even though I'm the town historian. My wife is Jewish. The Jews are buried over on Route 33. Catholics are buried over on the end of Throckmorton Street. This is, I mean, it's essentially non-denominational, but most of the people we're going to see are white Protestants. And there are African American sections here, and you'll see they are on the fringes. It's really kind of shameful how this occurred. Nolan doesn't want me to talk about this, but I'll point out where some of the fringe graves are here, including some very prominent people in our town. Right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. The original cemeteries serving this area, most of the churchyards had cemeteries. St. Peter's, and we're going to talk a little bit more about St. Peter's as we go along. The Baptist Church Cemetery is on Barklow Avenue, which is really not an active cemetery. It's fully maintained by the Baptist Church, but to my knowledge, there haven't been burials there in many years. But Ed King is here somewhere. Ed, there you are. Ed has family in the Baptist Church Cemetery, also in Old Brick in Marlboro, also here in Maplewood. Ed's family goes back to Mayflower practically, so he has deep roots here. So the churches, then St. Rose started its own cemetery in the 1850s. So the roots of the churches, of the cemeteries, were with local churches. One, there had to be a place for the disposition of the body. Second, there was a spiritual aspect to one's death. There was a religious and spiritual aspect. So they were connected together through churchyards. And then as the Reformed Church gave up this part of the cemetery, cemeteries evolved into what we know today. Old Tenet is a very large cemetery in Manalapan. Is technically a separate body from the church. It operates independently from the church, but its roots were pre-Battle of Monmouth through their congregation.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, that could be a tour unto itself.
Yeah. All right, and you should introduce Mark too.
Oh, yeah, Mark Sweeney. So Kevin Coyne is our borough historian, and Mark Sweeney is with us. He's done a lot of research into it, so we're going to kind of share the stories as we go along the cemetery.
We split up the list, so he's doing a third. You're doing a third. I'm doing a third, right?
A little less for me, but yes.
Roughly in that. Roughly
You're
in
more
that.
familiar with Freehold than I am.
But anyway.
Glenn Cashin is here from the Monmouth County Historical Commission. Glenn's here. We do have a number of people. Ed King, as I said, has roots back to the beginning of our days here in Monmouth County. So we have a lot of local experts. Again, we're thrilled with the turnout. When we planned this, we didn't know if we'd have 5 people or 20 people. You just never know. So
It's interesting when we do the Springsteen tour, didn't get this many people. The Battle of Monmouth tour got like a dozen. I mean, this is really
a tremendous gathering.
And I would also, if you know something about somebody we say something about and we're wrong, please tell us, because we're not experts on all these people. We've been going through obituaries and archives, looking up the stories about them, but some of you may know something we don't know. So please tell us that and add to the knowledge.
The process of this actually kind of started like like 25 years ago when the fire department anniversary celebrated. We were working on the history of the fire department, and we thought, who are these people that founded the fire department? You know, where did they live? What did they do for a living? We didn't know. So we came out and walked around, found some graves, went back to the Monmouth County Historical Society. Those days, put microfilm in the machine, read it, you know, would read all this, and then print those out. Today, the newspapers.com search engine is just unbelievable. I don't know how it does that, but we find information, and it's just amazing that the searches that we can do and come up with things. So.
I do have to add, I don't know if it's a correction or just a supplemental bit of information, but back maybe about 25 years ago when Kevin and I had a daughter in Girl Scouts, you and Kevin did the Maplewood History Tour with the Brownies. Do you remember that?
No.
Yeah.
We did.
Yeah.
When Laura was in Girl Scouts. Yeah, we would go around and they were more fascinated by the gopher holes than anything else. But yeah, I remember that.
So this is chapter 2.
We get some props, Girl Scouts,
Okay.
for being part of this.
Speaking of gopher holes, we are going to try to stay on the avenues, on the driveways. It's an old cemetery. It is a little bit uneven, so we're going to walk across the grass at some points, but we're going to try to stay on the walkways as we go ahead. All right,
Number 1.
we're going to start with the Hall Monument, which is to my right as I'm looking at it. Mark is going to take Campbell, excuse me, the Campbell Monument.
I'm just going to stand here because everybody can hear me from this point. James W.S. Campbell, at 18 years of age, entered the employ at the Long Branch Banking Company. In June of 1875, he came to the First National Bank of Freehold and was appointed as assistant cashier, then moved up to cashier, becoming director, vice president, and president. In 1925, he was given a testimonial dinner in honor of his 50 years of service. He was also a 39-year vestryman at St. Peter's Episcopal Church. His great-grandfather, John Campbell, came from Scotland and settled in Freehold. He was one of the original 12 whom the Charter of St. Peter's was granted to by King George III. 4 of his sons were in the Continental Army during the War of Independence. Through one of them, he became a hereditary member of the Order of Cincinnati. Now, the Order of Cincinnati, in 1783, George Washington was elected the first president of the Society of Cincinnati. It was an organization of military officers who served in the Revolutionary War. Their motto was, he gave up everything to serve the Republic. That story goes back to the story of Quintus Cincinnaticus. He was a Roman fighter. He was also a farmer. At one time, the Aegeans were fighting the Romans, and they had no defense against them, and they knew that they were going to lose. So they called Cincinnaticus forward to fight the war and to lead it all as basically a dictator. After 15 days, the war was ended, and he just returned back to his farm and went back to his plow, and everything was fine. Where he could have achieved dictatorship, he did not. So when General Washington also did that for the Continental armies, he just returned back to Mount Vernon and became a farmer again. So it was emulated that he was like Cincinnaticus, so he was the first president of the Order of Cincinnati. As far as the Campbell family, he had 2 sons. One of them, excuse me, I just lost the page, was Edmund Campbell. He was the Dean of Architecture at the University of Virginia, and his other son, Henry Campbell, a civil engineer, was the superintendent of the Manila Railroad Company in the Philippines.
And they lived in that cool house right on 3 doors down from Nolan. Yeah.
Right as you're coming off of Court Street, the house on the right, which is now a law office, was Campbell's house.
Number 2?
Interestingly, at the University of Virginia, the architecture school building is called Campbell Hall after his son. And the University of Virginia, obviously, is a premier architecture school in the country. So it's his son. The building is named after his son. To my right is Joseph Story. August 2nd, 1933. There was a fire in a clothing factory in the market yard, right behind the American Hotel, at the back side of the market yard. 3 firemen died, 2 were buried at St. Rose. Joseph Story is buried here. In addition, 10 firemen were very severely burned. So in our fire department history, the darkest day of the fire department history is August the 2nd, 1933. Joseph Story survived for about a week after the fire from his burns. The firemen were taken from the market yard, from the Pulchek factory, up to Governor Parker's house on Main Street. And we have verbal histories of the terrible, it must have been a horrific scene there, with firemen laid out on the front lawn of the Parker house, burned, injured from this fire. They were taken to St. Francis Hospital in Trenton, and I believe to Fitkin. One passed away soon after the fire, another a couple days later, and Joseph Story passed away about a week after the fire. His daughter became the borough clerk, and many of you may know Vivian Taylor. Vivian Taylor was the daughter of Joseph Story. So we have fire department history in the firehouse. You'll see their picture. And Joseph Story and the two brothers. There were a number of these little clothing factories around town. And Kevin can maybe speak to this. Back in the 30s, a lot of Eastern Europeans had come and worked in these factories. They were small, kind of scattered around town.
But also, they didn't go to Governor Parker's house because Governor Parker was there. They went to Governor Parker's house because
It was Freehold Hospital.
that house across from Borough Hall. That was the original Freehold Hospital, and that's why they brought them there. So there are a handful of people in this. I don't know if anybody here who are truly borough natives, because they were buried there. And I think Carl, where are you? Was your mother born there?
Yes, she was.
Bingo. There's one. Yeah. What's that?
Freehold had a very well-established educational system from its earliest days. There was a ladies' seminary here. There were military schools here. The Vice President of the United States began his education here. So Kevin's going to tell us, start to tell us the history of education and schools through this gravesite.
I'm first going to tell you who this elusive vice president is, who he's mentioned twice and hasn't named.
You always tell me don't give
Don't
it
bury
away.
the lead. Don't bury the lead. Garrett Hobart was vice president under McKinley, and he was born in Marlboro Village, right next to the firehouse in Marlboro Village, right near where, right there. And he would have been president had he not died before McKinley died. So he died, and Roosevelt became president. Roosevelt became vice president. Teddy Roosevelt then became president. So anyway, so he went to school at right where Tony's Diner is, basically. There was a school there. This is before universal public education. If you wanted to go beyond a one-room schoolhouse, you had to have some dough. And so there were a series, because this was the county seat. It was the only town of any substance for quite a while. This is where all the schools were. Major Duncan, he's got a pretty grand grave because he had a pretty grand life. And where St. Rose School is now, was a school called the Freehold Institute. It started before the Civil War, and it was a very elite kind of prep school. It was the male equivalent of the Young Ladies Seminary, which we'll talk about at another point. And after that school closed, it became the Freehold Military School. And this guy here ran it for 50 years, from 1901 to 1948. After the Second World War, he got sick. People didn't want to send their kids to military school after 400,000 Americans just died, and the school died. And St. Rose bought this grand old building, then bulldozed it, and built the new school. So this guy was born in Panama, because he was from a military family. That's why you see his middle name is Miguel. And he came to Freehold in 1901, ran this school, and he had a daughter. This is the cool part. One of his daughters married a guy named Larry Kelly. And now those of you who are football fans might know that Larry Kelly was the second Heisman Trophy winner, 1937. He was a Yale All-American. Married Major Duncan's daughter at St. Peter's in this lavish ceremony. They lasted 3 years. Larry Kelly ended up marrying 3 other times, and he ended up as a teacher and coach at the Petty School. He needed money at the end of his life. He sold his Heisman Trophy, and he shot himself 6 months later. It's a really tragic story. Larry Kelly, look it up. But that was his daughter, who I don't think she's not buried. No, she's not. Wait a minute. Yes, she is. She's buried here. No, that's not her. I'm sorry, that's his wife. I apologize. All right, so the school, the military school, there was back in the early days of film, there was a really famous silent film actor by the name of Wallace Reed. And if those of you who are silent film screeners would know that name. He was like the Rudolph Valentino with the teens, not the 20s. And so he died of a morphine addiction after he became addicted to morphine when he was treated for an injury in a train wreck. Sound familiar? This happened in like 1924. Well, he's a graduate of that school. He came to this school. That's an idea of how people came from all over to go to this school. Those of you who remember it, my mother certainly remembers it. My father used to talk about how the military school boys would march down South Street to the Strand Theater on Saturday afternoons for the matinee, and that the St. Rose boys would make fun of them. All right? That's it. Okay.
We're going to continue up this way. We're going to go up into the oldest part of the cemetery.
Oh, wait, one more thing.
Oh, yeah.
Over by that red truck, it was where Stanley Dancer is buried. Horse people here. Stanley Dancer, horse people here. Stanley Dancer, Hall of Fame, one of the greatest harness drivers ever. Buried right over there.
Now, we're up in the oldest part of the cemetery. This was the original Dutch Reformed Church area, this corner of the cemetery. Now, I always try to figure out the topography of what this looked like back in those days. Oops. There was swampland down here. This tilted off toward Main Street. This was the outskirts of town. And in one of the articles, they said when the cemetery is established and fenced, there'll be no more cattle grazing in the cemetery. So we were definitely on the outside of town where we are now. Now, everyone's heard of Hull Avenue, McLean Street, so forth and so on. We're going to learn about the Hulls. Mark?
We're at the gravesite of John Hull. He was a Revolutionary War soldier. He's buried here with his third wife, Anne. He was a judge in the Monmouth County Courts for 25 years. He, along with Reverend Daniel B. McLean and Thomas Haight, founded the Freehold Young Ladies Seminary, which they'll be talking about later on in the tour. He was a resident of the village for over 60 years, and he owned over 17 acres of land at McLean and Main Streets. When he was a teenager, he was captured by the British in 1776, and he was held at Sugar House Prison in New York City. Sugar House Prison was one of 3 prisons in New York that was run by the British, and the Redcoats would capture Americans as well as those who were compassionate to the Americans, and they would store them in these prisons. The conditions were beyond deplorable in these places. It was said that over 17,500 people died in jail, more people that had died on the actual battlefield.
You see, we got 3 street names. We got Hull, we got Bound, we got McLean, all in one monument. And if you look here, this is his Revolutionary War marker. Since this cemetery was from 1850, if you go out to Kennett, there's a bunch of our Revolutionary War soldiers because that predates this. This is a later cemetery. But he was in when he was very young, and he lived a long time. And where we are here too, you see, first of all, Route 9 wasn't always there. Route 9 wasn't there until after the Second World War, actually, which is why there has to be a bridge for the horses to get across. If you go down that little hill there, what you'll find is the Ham family. And if you know the Ham family is one of the most prominent African-American families in this town. And they're buried amid the woods on the slope going down the road. Beyond them, in unmarked graves, are patients from Marlborough State Hospital unclaimed by their families. If you go to Marlborough State Hospital and you go across the street from there, there's this really poignant cemetery with just numbered graves that go up to like 1960, I think, right? And you know, those of you who don't know, Nolan is actually in this business, and his father, no, not the mental patient business, the burial business. And after they stopped burying there, his father had the contract, right?
Okay.
And he was paid to do that, and that's where they put them, right over there. So that's a part of our history.
Are they named here or just numbered?
They're not even numbers here.
I don't think it's very well recorded. The record keeping here was very good. Then it became very bad. Now it's back. It's vastly improved. The people that are now managing the cemetery are doing a much better job than
the people that came before.
But as far as we know, this is the only Revolutionary War soldier here, right? As far as we know? Yeah.
His daughter, Margaret, was married to McLean from McLean Street.
Well, let me tell you about this guy. I'll be quick. So did you know that Monmouth County included Ocean County until 1850? Ocean County didn't exist until 1850. Monmouth County was the whole area, which is now Monmouth and Ocean County. This guy was born in Toms River. He was a veteran of the War of 1812, and in 1846, living in Toms River, he was elected clerk of Monmouth County. After it split off, he moved to Freehold and became clerk of Monmouth County, which now was only Monmouth County, no longer Ocean County. So that's a little piece of geography for you.
Kevin, is that Christopher House that was next to the diner?
Yes. Historic Preservation Commission time here. All right. He lived in the house that no longer exists on next to Freeman Funeral Home. One of the few pre-Civil War houses we had in this town was torn down 2-3 years ago, perhaps, and that was his house. He lived there, and then it was an antiques place, it was a tea room, and now it's gone. We couldn't save it. Story for another time.
Memorial Day parades in the state of New Jersey, and celebrated every year. It's a huge parade if you haven't attended our parade. The parade traditionally would start in town, travel some of the streets, and work their way out to this plot right over here. We can walk over here. This is the grave of Captain James Conover, who lived in Freehold. His father died at a young age. He took over the family farm, took care of his mother, had some militia experience before the Civil War started, and then raised a company, which is about 100 men, raised a company for the 14th New Jersey. And they went into service from Camp Edinburgh out near Old Tenant. He was wounded at the Battle of Monocacy in Maryland, had a wound which never really healed. He continued on in service, made his way back to Monocacy, fell ill there. His wife came down from Freehold to see him there, and he died in Frederick, Maryland, and was eventually brought back to Freehold to be buried here in the family coffin. The Memorial Day parade would come down Main Street and end here. This was the closing ceremony of the Memorial Day parade for many, many years. The GAR post in Freehold was named in his memory. Bill?
Wasn't it called Decoration Day in those days?
I'm sorry.
What's it called, Decoration Day?
Decoration
Where
Day.
they would decorate the grave.
Yeah. Bill Magano's bringing up a point. Memorial Day was called Decoration Day in those days because the graves were decorated.
Okay.
Okay?
No, we just didn't know the name.
Captain James Conover.
Thank you.
To our right, to my right, the obelisk is Major Peter Vredenberg. Vredenberg Avenue, Freehold. Major Vredenberg was also in the 14th. Was a local hero, was a lawyer, a very promising lawyer. Went into the Army, became an adjutant, a legal adjutant in the service. Was in charge of the Frederick, Maryland area. Was killed in September of 1864 at Winchester, Virginia. His body was brought back, buried here, and we've told this Vredenberg story to other tourists. He was a local hero. His father was a prominent lawyer. His father served on the state Supreme Court. His mother's maiden name was Brinkerhoff. He was a Brinkerhoff. The Vredenbergs and the Brinkerhoffs were very, very early American people. They came from Holland in the late 1600s. So again, another prestigious, very prestigious old family. We're going to visit the Vredenbergs again on the other side of the cemetery. But this is Major Peter Vredenberg. His father, Peter Vredenberg, and his mother, I'm drawing a blank on the first name of the lady, was Brinkerhoff. The Brinkerhoffs owned Brinkerhoff Avenue. That was the Brinkerhoff farm. From Maine to south, and all the streets aside with the Brinkerhoff farm. Okay.
Can you mention the horse?
The horse?
What happened?
Yeah, so he died when he was leading his men on a charge over a rise. Follow me, men. He gets hit. His horse gets hit in the ear, right? His horse's name is Dolly. They bring his body back, bury him here at a great ceremony. They bring Dolly back. And for the next 20 years, Dolly led the parade here.
They would dress Dolly in her Civil War regalia that she wore in battle, and his brother, William Bedford, found the horse and arranged to bring the horse back to Freehold.
And it was said that his dog came out here, right?
He had a dog. He had a dog that he took to the Civil War with him and lived with him.
And came out to the grave.
Did the dog come here?
The dog came out to the grave. This is what I read, and laid his head on the grave. And his father died to let the book.
His father died. His father, it's a very dramatic story. His father went to Florida after Major Peter Rittenberg's death. Went to Florida and died in Florida. And the stories of the day say he died in Florida having a broken heart, never recovering from the death of his son. So it's a very dramatic story from the Rittenbergs. And they were very promising people. They were both very, very promising lawyers. And we have a lot of promising the legal community in Freehold in those days was like, really, because of the courthouse, was really a big profession. They have a couple lawyers, at least one lawyer who's dead. Right behind you. Where is he? Vince Holler, remember? Continuing on the 14th New Jersey, this is a Civil War soldier who I didn't know was here until we started to do some research for this project, and I found the story of him being moved to the cemetery. His father was born in Northern Ireland. This is kind of one of those great American success stories. His father was born in Northern Ireland, came to the United States in the 1820s, worked at a farm in Gloucester County, became friends with, I guess today's equivalent would be the Secretary of Agriculture for the federal government. He had a farm in Gloucester County, became a good farmer, learned to farm. Also met a carpenter, learned to be a carpenter, and built the Second Presbyterian Church in Trenton. So he must have been an accomplished carpenter who built a church. After doing that, he moved to Freehold. His name was Andrew Ross. He has two children. One was William Burroughs Ross, who was buried here. He joined the 14th at the start of the Civil War. Must have been a very personable guy. There's a book called Upon the Tented Field, which is a collection of letters from the 14th New Jersey written back to Freehold. It was published by a history teacher at Marlborough High School. And among those letters are Ross's letters back to his mother in Freehold. And he writes back and he asks about the ladies at the ladies' seminary, wants pictures of the women, wants to know about the dances that are held, all those typical things that a young guy in the Army would want to know. So he writes back to home. He's killed in the Civil War. He's wounded toward the end of the Civil War and killed. He was buried in the South, was moved from the South to Trenton. He was buried in Trenton for a number of years. And then, from what I can gather, his parents lived on Center Street in Freehold. They're buried here. His father gave up the carpentry business and opened a greenhouse right about at the back of where the phone company is at Main and Center. In that back property was the Ross house and greenhouses. So they're buried here. Ross was brought from Trenton and buried here. This appears to be his original monument. This must have been brought along with him. This is his family monument. And he has a GAR emblem. If you see these along the graves, this is the GAR emblem from the Grand Army of the Republic. In these old sections, you'll see a number of these.
He's a licensed field director. He's allowed to do that. You're not allowed to do that.
So that tells the story between Conover, Vredenberg, and Ross. Gives a little feeling of what went on during the Civil War in Freehold. He writes back at election time in 1864, he writes to his mother, "Do you think McClellan or Lincoln will win?" He said the soldiers were going to vote for Lincoln. His feeling is that Monmouth County people are going to vote for McClellan, who was running against Lincoln in 1864. And McClellan did carry New Jersey, carried 3 states. New Jersey was one of them. But he was a native son to New Jersey. He's buried in Trenton. He was a Civil War general, well known for getting troops ready, but never pulled the trigger, so to speak, and put them into action. So Lincoln let him go during the war, and then he ends up running against Lincoln for president. All right, we'll go back this way to the turn right into Stratford. To your right and behind you is the Throckmorton plot. Yeah. Kevin's going to talk a little. No, go ahead. No, but that's the Throckmorton plot. We're going to talk about the Denice plot, which is right here. If you may remember the.
You want me to do both?
Yeah.
Okay. So the Throckmortons, if you go into St. Peter's Church, half the stained glass windows say Throckmorton on them. They were among the original settlers. They were Dutch, though. Were they? Yeah. I don't know how they got to St. Peter's instead of Presbyterian. They argued with some minister somewhere along the way. So A.R. Throckmorton, Aaron Ray Throckmorton, is here, and he was a lawyer in town. He studied. Back then, you didn't go to law school like Vince. You studied in a law office, and he studied with a guy by the name of William Dayton. William Dayton was the first Republican vice presidential candidate. First time the Republicans ran a ticket was John Fremont and William Dayton. William Dayton was a lawyer from Freehold. Dayton, New Jersey is named for him. He lived here for a while. He's not buried here. Closest thing we got is A.R. Throckmorton, who was his law clerk. And then A.R. Throckmorton, because this is a small town, he studied with Judge Redenberg. So they were all tied in together. He was a surrogate. He was one of the founders of the fire department, right, Nolan? Yes. Although was he a fireman himself? Because this is confusing to me, because the Great Fire of 1874, right, that burned half of Main Street, they didn't wake him up. And did you know this? They didn't wake him up. And his whole law library burned down. It was the biggest law library in the county, and it burned down in the Great Fire of 1874. The fire department that he founded didn't get him there in time. Right? And in 1870, there's another little trivia thing I found. 1873, Governor Parker, who we'll meet later, who was from Freehold, whose house was the Freehold Hospital, as you remember. Governor Parker appointed him as the New Jersey Commissioner to the 1873 World's Fair in Vienna, Austria, which was celebrating the 25th anniversary of Emperor Franz Joseph. So this guy here was in Austria celebrating with Franz Joseph. The Denice family is another early Dutch family, and it was originally spelled Denyjs, I think, wasn't it? I think so. But anyway, where's Walter? Walter. So this one's particularly meaningful to me. I wrote a book about some World War II veterans from Freehold, and one of them was Walter Denice. I read about 6 of them, and Walter was the one who, well, his father was one too, so I'm not going to rank them. But Walter was in the 324th Infantry. He grew up on a farm where Colts Glen and Colts Brook is on Route 537, right before Route 18. Route 18 went right through his farm. And Ed, where's Ed? Is Ed still here? He's here over there. Ed, you lived in his house, right? Correct. You lived in the original Denice farmhouse. Still own it. You still own it. Okay. Is it on the east side of 18, right? Right. So Walter he was a Christian Scientist. He was a very deeply religious man. And in 1940, well, I'm not going to remember it actually. The main thing to remember of Walter Denice is that one of his comrades was wounded on the battlefield. Walter crawled out to get him, dragged him back, saying the Lord's Prayer over and over again. Stanley Benezet, I met these two guys together once. We met at the Applebee's in Manalapan. Stanley Benezet and Walter Denice, the man whose life he saved and the man who saved his life. And as I said, Stanley Benezet was Catholic. So he didn't say the kingdom and the power and the glory. And Walter kept finishing the prayer for him. And that's why he lived, because Walter finished the prayer.
So, one of my theories on the moving around from Protestant church to Protestant church is when the guy married the woman, that was it.
That's where they
Whatever
went?
she was, that's what he became.
That's where they went.
Because he didn't care so much, but unless it was business oriented. But the woman was very,
Yeah. Well, St. Peter's is just filled with Throckmortons. Throckmortons and Allens. One side is Throckmortons, the other side is Allens, right?
Well, yeah, and to Ed's point, St. Peter's, the Redbergs were all Dutch Reformed people. And the next generations went to St. Peter's because he married a Hartshorn. So I'm thinking that your theory proved itself out with the Redbergs.
common sense.
Yeah. Laird monument is to my right. When you think of Laird, this is the Laird family. Interesting. This family was in the distillery business. The Monmouth Democrat carried his obituary. The Monmouth Democrat were published by the Yard family, who were members of the Temperance Union. There's no mention of the distillery business in his very lengthy obituary. It says he's in the general merchandise business. So later on, in later obituaries in the family, he ties it all together through Lairds. But our governing body members who are here, this is one of your predecessors. This is Joseph Laird. He lived in the house next to the Knights of Columbus on East Main Street. Very old Tainate Victorian home. That was the Laird home. Again, bank president, all the things that we've talked about with many of our families carries over with the Lairds. And Lairds is still operated by the Laird family for hundreds of years now.
Still selling general merchandise.
Still selling general merchandise. Good, we'll continue on. The monument to my left is the Vogt Monument, of course, Vogt Avenue in Freehold. Dr. Vogt was born in New York, was trained to be a pharmacist, came to Freehold, was a very prominent attorney, physician. His brother had military service. He joined at the beginning of the Civil War, served in the New York outfit. Interesting story about the Vogts. Dr. Vogt's brother married Ryle, who we just heard about. They owned what was referred to as the Ryle Mansion, which is about where CVS is today on West Main Street. During a big fire of 1873, or where's Kevin? 74. The courthouse burned from the courthouse toward the firehouse. If you can picture that, jumped Court Street, started to burn up Main Street. Got to the Vogt Mansion, burned the Vogt Mansion down, and the only recourse the fire department had was to tear down the next building. So this is their home, and they were in Europe on a trip. Imagine going to Europe in 1873. They were in Europe on a trip. While they were away, this conflagration comes through Freehold, burns this mansion down, and then the fire department, in those days, the only thing they could do was tear down what was the next thing to burn. So they stopped the fire, and they were actually credited with saving the town by tearing down this building next to their home on West Main Street.
That must feel worse than actually having it burned.
And then Vogt went up to Brinkerhoff Avenue and built a home next to William Vredenberg's home on Brinkerhoff. It's described in the paper. Sounds like a very palatial place. 3 stories and big Victorian.
Were those two Victorians that were almost twins to look at?
On Brinkerhoff?
Brinkerhoff, yeah.
Vredenberg's
One of them
is still
there.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, and then where Mr. Herman's house was.
I think the house is there. But I don't think their house is there any longer.
Right. No, I saw pictures that looked like 2 identical houses, well, not identical, not mirror, but very similar.
Okay.
They're both Victorian, ornate, like
One must have been.
the one that's there.
Yeah.
And they chopped some of it and moved it to the back.
Okay.
On the second.
Is that Laird family different than the one over here?
I don't know how I'm assuming there's some connection, but I don't know.
And then when did
In the late 1800s, 1900s, early 1900s.
And where'd they get it from?
Most granite today comes from Barry, Vermont. There's a large granite quarry in Barry, and today's monuments are mostly from Barry. I don't know if these came from Barry or not. Bree, do you know? Bree does a lot of cemetery work, by the way. So.
Oh.
Okay. But Barry, Vermont is like the granite capital of the United States. It's quite, you can imagine moving these monuments around, in the 1880, moving without equipment to put something like this up.
And he was the founder and eventually ran it until he died, and then his wife, Amos Richardson. Just want to read you, this is from the obituary. Last Sunday morning, just as the congregations of our several churches were coming for religious worship, the shadow of death fell upon a couch at the Freehold Young Ladies Seminary, whereupon the beloved preceptor lay, and soon his glad spirit had winged its way to God who gave it. Right? And if Nolan just pointed out, on the back of this monument here, it says, a tribute to a venerated preceptor and Christian counselor of his pupils and teachers. This guy was born in New Hampshire, came here in 41, and McLean, Hull, and Height founded the school. They hired him. He and his wife ran it. He was blind in one eye from a childhood accident, and then they were building a new building about 10 years later, and there were workmen downstairs putting in gas line for a chandelier, and he heard the noise, and he bent down. The auger came right up, blinded him in his other eye. So the poor guy is blind for the rest of his life and running this school with his wife. This school, the founder of the kindergarten movement in the United States went to this school. The provost of Vassar College went to this school. The Monmouth County Historical Association did a wonderful presentation exhibit a while back about Young Ladies Seminary, about all, at a time when women's education was not particularly valued. This place valued it and sent these women on into the world. So Amos Richardson, you can thank him for that. And he was also a founder of the fire department, right, Nolan? His son was. Okay. He was it his son who rang the bell? Yes. So the fire department didn't have a bell, right? And so when there was a fire call, his son went and rang the bell, right, to call the firemen in the Young Ladies Cemetery. Got it. Okay. Got it. Okay. Back in the day, before newspapers, well, they've died more recently, but back in the 19th century and the early 20th century, there were multiple newspapers in this little town. They covered all of the county. And if you go back and read them, if you had a birthday party in 1924, it was in the newspaper and a list of everybody who was at the party. Everything that you put on Facebook was in the newspaper for everyone to know. Edwin Applegate came from a New York City newspaper family, and he run a series of newspapers. Then he came to Freehold, and he started he owned the Monmouth Inquirer, which has not existed for many years. But he was also a colonel in the 29th New Jersey Volunteers during the Civil War. But this is the thing that struck me. So when he died, the Monmouth Inquirer had his obit, and it had this quote: "We return thanks to Major Yard for the assistance in helping us issue this week's Inquirer." Major Yard, whose house Nolan lived in, ran the Monmouth Democrat. So when poor Applegate died, his competitor helped put out his paper for him.
That's when they used to do.
John Borden. There was a very, very well-known iron foundry behind Hillpots. Hillpots is so long ago, maybe somebody doesn't know where Hillpots is. Behind off of Throckmorton Street and Monmouth Avenue. Carl Steinberg had a few buildings there. Borden's iron foundry was there. He was born in England. He came to Brooklyn, was a fireman in Brooklyn, came to Freehold and operated this foundry. They built gates for the White House. They did, things like that. They were big ornamental iron people. He was considered to be the first chief of the fire department. At the fire of 1873, he was the one that directed operation. He's the one that directed that building to be torn down next to Boat's Mansion. And he lived in Freehold. He lived on Manalapan Avenue. Again, one of these firms from the old days that are kind of lost to history, but these are the kinds of industries that we had in Freehold then. Good, we'll continue. This is the Yard plot. They lived at the corner of West Main and Yard Avenue, coincidentally. And this is the family that published the Monmouth Democrat. They came to Freehold from Hightstown, published, it was an overtly political newspaper. Back McClellan during the Civil War. Yard was very tight with Joel Parker and all the state Democrats. He was one time promoted to run for governor. And this is all his family here. His family continued to run the paper after he died. They belonged to the Methodist Church in Freehold. He was a licensed Methodist preacher. His funeral was held in the church, and then he was buried here. So I know the Yard family like inside and out, but that's the history of the Yard family. So they're the Democratic newspaper people. The Monmouth Democrat closed in 1930 something. It stopped publication. It's on. You can read it. It's available on microfilm, and it's available on newspapers.com.
Are they still around? Any relatives of theirs?
This is Joel Parker. This guy thought about running for governor. This guy ran for governor twice. Joel Parker was born in Smithsburg, went to Princeton. A lot of these early movers and shakers from Freehold were Princeton graduates. So he went to Princeton. His resume is printed right here, just in case you wanted to make sure you knew what it was.
Oh my.
So he was governor during the Civil War.
He was a proud boy.
He was governor from 1863 to 66. He was actually the first guy elected twice as governor. 1863 to 66, then again from 72 to 75. So he was governor during the Civil War. Now, you know, New Jersey was not a particularly enthusiastic participant in the Civil War, right? New Jersey had more slaves than any other state above the Mason-Dixon line. This guy actually believed in preserving the Union. Not so sure about the Emancipation Proclamation, though, right? So when Lincoln needed troops for Gettysburg, he raised troops. Emancipation Proclamation, 13th Amendment, no. So he was the man in the 19th century. This guy, before Bruce, this was like our most famous guy, right? Because he was governor twice, and he became Supreme Court Justice. The reason we have the Battle of Monmouth Monument in front of the courthouse is this guy. He's the one who first started the movement to do that. The next governor we're going to meet Beadle. Is he next? Beadle became governor because this guy wanted him to become governor, right? It was his choice. Do I have that right?
They were Democratic colleagues.
They were Democratic colleagues. So his house is right across from Borough Hall. It's that white wedding case house that became the Freehold Hospital, original Freehold Hospital. Excuse me. Ulysses S. Grant visited him in that house.
Wow.
So Ulysses S. Grant came through town to visit him. So on to the next governor. You doing Beadle next?
This is Governor Beadle's plot. This area is enclosed by the fence for all his family. He was from Montana, Seaport. He really didn't have a Freehold connection, but he married a Freehold family. And these plots, McGee was a prominent attorney in Jersey City. Randolph was from Freehold. This group were all Freehold connections. That's how he ended up being buried. He was on the state Supreme Court. I've just learned this. The state Supreme Court then was not the highest court in New Jersey. It was Court of Errors and Appeals was actually the top court in New Jersey. I always thought the state Supreme Court was. Pardon? The Constitution of 1947. The Constitution of 1947 changed this. But when I read this, I thought, we have two Supreme Court justices here, which I guess, and they called them justices. Pardon? No big deal. We do have a court, we do have a judge from the Errors and Pleas. We'll get to that. So this is Beadle. The grave right here under this bush, this tree, is Amos Richardson's son, Charles. He was in this is who, there's a fire company called Richardson Engine Company No. 2, still in existence today. That was named after Charles Richardson. So he's the son. After the Lee Seminary closed, he moved to Beverly and then passed away, and he was brought back and buried here in Freehold. But he's considered one of the founders. And stop, we're at the Crater plot, Crater Monument.
David Crater was born in 1846. He joined the Monmouth Democrat at the age of 16. 2 years later, he went over to A.R. Throckmorton, who Kevin had spoken about earlier. He was the surrogate of Monmouth County. When Mr. Throckmorton retired, Mr. Crater was appointed as the surrogate. He resigned the office of April 1912 to assume the office of the Secretary of State, to which he was appointed by that time Governor Woodrow Wilson. He served as surrogate of Monmouth County for over 30 years. He was the Secretary of State for New Jersey, and he was the Freehold Town Treasurer for 40 years. He was also a member of the Goodwill Hook and Ladder Company. In 1904, Combs and Ellis, they were a building company that dealt in lumber and building materials. That was owned by his father-in-law. They become incorporated, and he was one of the incorporators of Gilbert and Combs. When he passed away on April 6th of 1915, his funeral was from his residence at 57 Main Street, which is right across from the Freehold Bank and the Parker House. They were all located right in that area. His funeral was extremely large and attended by many dignitaries both on state and local levels. When his funeral started at 11 o'clock, all the businesses in town shut down and all the schools closed for the hour for his funeral services. One of his personal friends was President Woodrow Wilson. He sent a floral piece and a telegram. His condolence and telegram stated, "My heart goes out to you in deepest sympathy. The state has lost an able and loyal servant, and I feel that I have lost a true friend." He was survived by his wife, Annie Combs, who was the daughter of Gilbert Combs from the lumber company, and Annie Haight was his daughter, and she was married to Judge Thomas Haight, and he was also survived by another daughter when he passed.
Bushes are down through this area are all Vredenberg interments. His brother, William Vredenberg, was on the highest court. Vince, where's my attorney? Vince, the Court of Errors and Pleas, correct? Errors and Appeals. In the state. He was a judge on the highest court in the state. Right.
All right, this is a trifecta. This was the big final. All right, this is a trifecta right here first. Where's Charles Haight?
To your left.
Over here.
Oh, Charles Haight, Congress. We're gonna meet the Haight family plot over here, and they got an interesting story. But this guy was in Congress. Congressman from 1867 to 71. He was a brigadier general during the Civil War. He was the commander of Camp Vredenberg. Camp Vredenberg was
named after the father of Major Vredenberg.
It was out on the Englishtown Road, but you know where that big old house is? It's a sort of park headquarters thing. Right before you get to Tennant Church, behind that was Camp Vredenberg. That's where they trained before they got on the train and went off to the Civil War. So he was the commander of that. All right, so that's number one. You notice I said trifecta because you see what that is over there?
What?
Those are the barns for the Freehold Raceway.
Oh.
Right, those are the barns for the Freehold Raceway, which is the hat I'm wearing.
Oh.
I thought that was appropriate for today. Right? All right, then Enright. Where's Enright?
Straight ahead.
Behind straight ahead. All right, Enright. All right, we got an education thing going here. All right, Enright started the first public school in Freehold in 1871. Freehold had the first high school in the county. Where the Hudson Manor is now, where the Hudson Street School is. Some of you might have gone to school to Hudson Street School. I went to kindergarten there. Is the upstairs of it was the first high school in the county. So remember, 1871. This is when public education is finally trying to become universal. So Enright was a really, really influential guy because he ran the schools in Freehold for years and years. Where the old police station was originally the Bennett Street School on the corner of Bennett and Hudson Street. It's now an office building. One of the things, by the way, the Historic Preservation Commission can say they saved, thank you, and it is now a renovated office building. That was the first high school building. He planted it all around that. If you look at old postcards and pictures, there are trees from all over the world he planted around because he wanted it to be this aesthetic experience as well as educational. He became the state education commissioner ultimately. Enright Avenue, past it on your way out there, and he also created it was the first school, Tom Ritchie will appreciate this, first school to have an agricultural course. That he thought that here we are in the middle of a farming area, they should be learning agriculture as well as Latin. But then this guy right here, Samuel Lockwood, this is maybe my favorite guy. So this guy has, do you know that male seahorses give birth? You know this?
Yeah.
That's not a myth. You know who discovered that? Samuel Lockwood. Samuel Lockwood was one of these 19th century naturalists who had aquariums and fossils and stuff. He lived on Broad Street. He lectured at the Freehold Institute, which is where the Freehold Military School was. He had a PhD. Actually got the PhD for this seahorse thing he discovered. There's a fossil named after him, Calopteris lockwoodi, He found it up in the Catskills, this ancient giant fern, and he was the county school superintendent for many years. Born in England, came to America as a young man. Oysters. He went to oysters in Keyport, ferns in the Catskills. And he was just all over the place collecting crap. And so, but this is the thing. I knew a little bit about him, but this thing I didn't know about him until I started doing this. In 1870, he started a free night school for freed slaves.
Oh, wow.
He was such a believer in education that at a time when who was worrying about the education of freed slaves, he started a night school for them. So, thank you, Samuel Lockwood. I think he's a cool guy.
Is the street named after him?
The street is named after him, and I think it's an accident that street was traditionally an African American neighborhood. I don't know why that happened. I don't know if they named it that. Because I don't know why. But yes, Lockwood Avenue, right across the street from my house, traditional African American neighborhood, is named for Samuel Lockwood.
As you walk through this section, we stop here. Now this looks different, doesn't it, than the rest of the area? These are very old monuments. These monuments and the people who were buried here were moved here from St. Peter's Church in 1892. There's not a lot of record as to this movement. The church was expanding the parish house at that time. I'm sure it's more than a coincidence that this construction happened and these people were moved. There's reference to these graves, and I'm not quite sure where this is, but between St. Peter's Church and Main Street, there was a notation about graves facing Main Street. So I believe, I don't really have the documentation to show it, but I believe these were the graves. There are, I'll read some of the names, the last names. Bartleson, Foreman, Higgins, no relation. Gentry, Lloyd, Stillwell, Throckmorton. You get the gist of who was buried in this plot. And this block of graves that you see with these old monuments were relocated from St. Peter's to here.
The Methodist Church had a similar story, where the parsonage is now used to be a burial ground, which I love telling all the ministers that. But I don't know if they ended up here. They just
some of them were here.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me because it's Freehold.
The law was passed in 1857 or 58 that allowed the churches to discretion over disinterments and everything. So I read about that one, and I do have, if I could get your contact info, I think I have a list.
The church has a list of names.
Yeah, there was one of the newspaper articles. It has a whole list and the dates that they were reinterred.
I know in the trustee minutes of the Methodist Church, which is now United, they were saying, okay, we need to contact these families because we need to have these disinterred. Yeah, I do. Okay.
What about the headstones that are there now? There's nobody buried there, right?
No, they were moved from Toponemus, I think, right, to that location, but there are no burials there.
No, they're just stones?
Yeah, probably burials. The stones just don't correspond with who's there.
Yeah, right.
But they're from Toponemus, off of Toponemus Road in Marlboro.
Right.
And they were being vandalized, and like they were developing over there in the 70s, so they moved some of them over to St. Peter's. The rest are still back there. You can go back there anytime.
And like, it's still there?
Oh yeah, sure.
Just to protect the monuments.
Yeah, real graves, real stones, yeah.
I haven't seen them.
Yeah, you got to put on your hiking boots. But yeah, if you park on Toponemus Road and follow the sign all the way back,
okay,
you'll see it.
There's also a story about soldiers being buried at the corner of Main and Throckmorton after the Battle of Monmouth.
Yes.
That's a little hard to
British,
figure
right?
too.
The hospital, the church was supposedly used as a British hospital or something.
And they're buried, I think, on the opposite corner from that description I can gather.
Oh, the Italian ice place, or?
No, on the other
corner. Oh, the opposite. Okay, gotcha.
We'll keep on going.
Dr. William Hepburn lived 2 doors from where Nolan lives now. And remember the, who was it, Mark Campbell? Was that the guy?
Yes.
Yeah, next to where Campbell lived. It was a bed and breakfast for a while called Hepburn House. He was the main doctor in town, he was a beloved doctor in town. And, but what's interesting is his daughter Clara, who's here, married Hallam Conover, who was Hallam and Warren Conover were the father-son architecture team that built most of the prominent buildings in Freehold during a long period of time. But his other daughter, who's buried in Montana somewhere, is a really interesting one. Her name was Nina Hepburn Dinwoody, and she was a novelist and an artist in the 1930s and 40s. Nolan's father told me that when he was in high school, they made them read her book, Storms Over the Labrador. She worked with the native population in Labrador, Quebec, Canada, and wrote a novel about it and had these paintings. She's not here though. But that's the same family, Dr. Hepburn. So,
We're at the Bennett Monument. We have a Bennett with us.
Oh, Bennett.
Oh, okay. Now you're gonna kill my whole story. No. I have to say Hudson Bennett was the one that I enjoyed the most looking up. Hudson Bennett inherited a large parcel of land from his father when his father passed away. And it was said to know that it was the largest section of Freehold. It ran from Main Street, it did all of Center Street, all the way down through the park. It was a whole big parcel of land that he inherited. He was credited with, well, first before that, the iron ore that was found on the Bennett farm was enough to supply the building of the original courthouse in Freehold. That all came from the Bennett land. In the 1890s, he laid out all the roads and the property on a map to sell off the larger parcels of land, and he also was instrumental in organizing the sewer system that we have today. He laid out all the roads, where the sewer pipes were going to be, and the sewer basin was at the lowest land of his property, which is located down at the end of Center Street now. He was a member of the Freehold Infantry, a Civil War time militia company. He was also among the first stockholders of the Freehold First National Bank. In December of 1853, the Monmouth County Agricultural Society was found to hold an annual fair with harness racing in the township of Freehold. In 1854, the society rented a 10-acre plot of land from Mr. Hudson Bennett, who rests here, for the sum of $50 a year. This site is what we know as Freehold Raceway.
and he had 2 streets named after him,
Hudson and Bennett. And I like it because every day I come to work, I drive right through his farm.
On our right is Charles Brakely. There was on Manalapan Avenue, Manalapan and Bound was Brakely's factory. It was said to be the largest pea and bean factory in the world.
Wow.
And it was located in Freehold. Charles Brakely owned 16 or 17 farms, up to like 2,000 acres of farmland. Kathy, raise your hand. Kathy lived in his house on the corner of Broad and Manalapan. Not the old library, across the street.
Brakely hired William Soden in 1892 to build that house. So that house dates from like April 1891, 1892.
And then Donahue, who was the surrogate, lived in that house. Across the street was McDermott. So we had the two political parties, opposite parties, on opposite corners.
And then after that, the Hodberg family bought the house. They're the first ones.
Then Hochberg's bought the house.
Right. But those two got along.
Yeah, they got along.
They lived across the street from each other, but they didn't have a fence between them. They got along with each other. Brakely also had so much. This was all stuff that got into cans: peas, lima beans, asparagus, and he had all these. He would bring workers down from the cities, and they had dormitories for them, separated by ethnicity. They would have Italians, they would have African Americans, they would have Poles in different dormitories for the people who picked and who worked in the cannery. It was a seasonal operation, so they were temporary workers.
They eventually closed and moved the company to Delaware. He died, the company was reorganized and moved to Delaware.
The reason we're on this side is because all these graves, although they're new, the bodies in them date to the 18th century, or what's left of the bodies in them date to the 18th century. The Height family, remember we met Charles Height over there, who was a congressman right after the Civil War? The Height family had a huge farm on Route 537 in Colts Neck. And they, so this guy, the first one, Joseph, he's the guy who came, he was a colonel in the Monmouth militia, and he had this big farm. His son, Charles, where's Charles? Charles owned ships in the China trade, China the country trade. Ships going back and forth with wallpaper, silks, pagodas, desks. furniture. That's what this guy did. These people had a ton of money. They had 100 slaves. They had a slave graveyard and they had a vault. They were in the vault. When the new owners, I think it was the new owners, or was it the new owners came, they wanted the vault out, they wanted to build a barn, right? They wanted to build a barn over the vault, something like that.
It was to be developed.
It was to be, oh, that's right, it was to be developed, yeah. And so they moved, they dug them all up. The slaves, you're on your own. But they dug up all the heights and they moved them here. So that's why they're here. The heights. Yeah. What's that? It was somewhere on Route 537. I don't know which property it was.
I think the wallpaper out of that house is
The wallpaper.
Winter Tour.
There was a wallpaper in that house in Winter. I think you're right on that. Yeah. These are some more. All these guys, Princeton. All of them went to Princeton. Yeah, that's what. Oh.
They went to Princeton too.
What's that?
Brakely went to Princeton.
Yeah, and then what was the errors and appeals? One of these guys was one of these. Where's Vince? One of these guys was a judge on the errors and appeals court too. So there we are. We didn't lose too many people. I'm surprised actually. Come on in. All right, so we're here not for the lanes. I'm sure the lanes are interesting. I just don't know anything about them. We're here because I can point there, and then our final stop is on the other side. Behind the curtain is our final stop. But I'm going to point down there for two reasons. One is, among the reasons Freehold is so interesting is its ethnic diversity from its very beginning. And that is where the Russian block is. And I don't know if you're aware, out on Waterworks Road, there's a little church, the Russian Baptist Church. Back at the beginning of the 20th century, just as Jews were being chased out of Rutgers for religious persecution, so were Baptists. So we're a little footnote to history. And a bunch of them ended up here in Freehold. There's this whole group. Anybody here from that Russian? No?
The one on Shibanoff and Waterworks?
I'm getting there. All right, so Shibanoff was the main player in this, right? So all along Pond Road, Waterworks Road, East Freehold Road, a bunch of little farms, whole bunch of these Russians, right? And Baptists mostly. The leader of the gang was a guy named Harry Shibanoff. Shibanoff Road, right off Route 9. Bus stops at Shibanoff, next stop, Shibanoff Road, right? The bus says. And you wonder, who the hell is Shibanoff, right? Well, Harry Shibanoff had this big farm. Brock's Farm is basically where Shibanoff's farm is now. And so, but in 1948, we were headlines all over America because of Harry Shibanoff. There was this Russian teacher. He was a defector, and he was going to testify before the House Un-American Committee about Russian espionage. 1948, right? The Russians are out to get him. You have to find a place to hide. You know where he hides? Harry Shibanoff's farm. Right? Reporters all over the place. Countess Alexandra Tolstoy. You know, there were red Russians back then and white Russians. You know, the communists and the ones who liked the Tsar, right? And so these people were all white Russians. There was a whole bunch of white Russians down in Lakewood too. You know, that's why we have all those Russian Orthodox churches down in Jackson and Lakewood, was the white Russian crowd, right? Well, we had a branch of them here, and Harry's buried over there, right? There's another guy buried somewhere over there that we could not find, that I really want to find someday, because along the fringe there, you know, you saw where the Ham grave was in the woods. Along the fringe, along the back over there are a bunch of graves from the African American community in Freehold. And there was a guy in Freehold named Ferdinand Fenderson. Ferdinand Fenderson came to Freehold in like 1910. He was said to be a Yale graduate. I haven't actually found a document of this. He was said to have studied law, but he was not a lawyer. So he worked for various lawyers in town as like a clerk. He was a leader of the black community in town. He was the first teacher at what was called then the Freehold Colored School. Excuse me. He brought W.E.B. Du Bois to Freehold in 1920 for Ferdinand Fenderson, right? He was protesting police brutality in 1937. He founded the NAACP chapter. He never had children. He lived on Hull Avenue with the Skank family, and he's buried somewhere over there. He's got a marker because he's in their list, but they don't know where it is, and someday I'm going to find it. And then around the corner behind the curtain is our final stop on our tour. Tex and Marion Vineyard, where Bruce's first managers, surrogate parents, chief champions, the guy who bought them bologna sandwiches, bought them microphones, took them to recording studios, took them to New York. They were the people who made Bruce what he was at the beginning of his career. She was so quiet and reserved and shy. I can see her spinning right now that we're talking. She died last year, and her obituary wasn't in the paper for how many months? Because
they didn't want the publicity of.
They didn't want Bruce fans coming to see, because you know Bruce, of course, was going to come to see her. Two most important days in Freehold's history: June 28, 1778, Battle of Monmouth, largest single land battle of the American Revolution, the only time the two commanding generals faced each other, largest artillery battle. September 23rd, 1949, Bruce Springsteen is born. And Tex and Mary. Tex and Mary had no children of their own. Tex worked at a cigarette paper factory in Helmeda. He worked at Brockway too, I think, didn't he? Did he work at, I don't know if he worked at Brockway. She was the longest serving county employee when she retired. She worked for the county for something like 50 some odd years. And they were the ones, when we, in 2002, we dedicated, Carl Beams had the idea. Where's Carl? Raise your hand. Carl Beams had the idea. They lived on Center Street in a duplex house, with what is now Vineyard Park. The house is gone. Carl had the idea that we should name it Vineyard Park, because we have a don't ask, don't tell relationship with Bruce. We don't name things after him. We don't build statues, because then he would stop coming, right? So Carl had the brilliant idea, well, he named it for vineyards, because they're the ones who really did for him what was important. And so that day, that morning, it was in April morning, I don't know, it was spring sometime anyway. Miserable, rainy morning. I was a councilman at the time. Mike Wilson, the mayor, called me up and said, it's a miserable morning. We were going to dedicate the park. He calls me up, 10 o'clock in the morning, he says, I don't know, it's a miserable day, what should we do? And I said, call Marion, it's her day, ask her what she wants to do. He calls me back too late, 2 minutes later, says, we got to do it, Bruce is already at her house. So there were only about 50 people there that day, and it was a beautiful ceremony because it was just filled with his love for them. Tex was already dead. What I remember most about what he said that day, he said, when everybody else in my life was telling me to turn it down, they told me to turn it up. Right? So we can thank her.